Hey there, my name's Jordan, and I'm a financial coach and financial planner. And today I'm your host at the Reimagine Wealth podcast, where we share imperfect stories about embodying our values, weaving just system level safety nets, and working to build the world that we want to live in, one where we all get to have our needs met and thrive. Let these be shared learnings that allow you to more deeply explore, experiment, and shift, and that allow us to unlock our collective knowledge. This show is ad-free and available to everyone, and it wouldn't be possible without your love and support. So if you like what you're listening to, please like, review, subscribe, and share the show with those in your community. If you're able, please support my work to produce the show by becoming a paid member of my Substack, which starts at $6 a month. Link to that and more is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And now let's get into the show. In this episode, you are going to hear from my dear friend and beloved co-conspirator, Susanna Penfield, who uses she and her pronouns. A little bit about Susanna. Susanna is an inheritor of intergenerational wealth and is dedicated to disrupting cycles of power from within privilege. Her work began personally, with years spent working to align inherited assets with social and ecological justice, ultimately leading to a family trust bust, which you'll hear more about in this episode. She now applies this experience as Director of Relationships at Chosen Family Office, where Susanna facilitates connections between wealth holders and aligned financial professionals in support of social movement-driven wealth redistribution. Susanna is also a senior fellow with the Impact Finance Center and is part of the launch team for Trustworthy Impact, the first ever 100% impact-oriented independent trust company. In addition, Susanna is an alumna of the Just Economy Institute, co-leader of the Vermont chapter of Resource Generation, and a member of the Solidaire Network. Susanna holds an MSc in Gender Studies from the London School of Economics, where her research focused on the role of white feminine guilt in narratives of wealth, and she's now entwining that work with her personal money journey through a Substack titled The Busted Chronicles, which I would definitely encourage you all to check out and listen to. Susanna earned a BA in political science and feminist and gender studies from Colorado College, and she was born and raised in Vermont. She now is living with her partner in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Susanna and I met through another beloved co-conspirator, Leo Freeman. We started working together actually at Chosen Family Office, and you're going to hear Susanna talk more about that throughout the episode, but Susanna and I were part of the founding team of Chosen Family Office, and she is someone I so deeply admire and look up to, and I'm thrilled for you all to hear a little bit of her story. And welcome, Susanna. I am so happy to have you here, my dear friend. And for guests on the show, I generally ask them to share their money story, which, as you know, being so deeply entwined in the RG space, is your own personal story about the way that money has moved throughout the course of your life and your family's lives. So as much or as little as you'd like to share, could you please introduce yourself in your own words and share a little bit about your money story with listeners?
Thank you, Jordan. I am so excited to be here. I'm so excited that you are doing this work of creating and sharing stories. I think it's a hugely pivotal part of wealth and money work generally across the board. My name is Susanna. I use she, her pronouns, and I think there are a lot of places that you can start a money story. I recently have been starting mine with my grandfather on my mom's side, mostly because he is the one who left me wealth that I have had to fight to gain direct access to, and so has become sort of the predominant narrative of this last period of my life and the narrative that really launched me into the work that I do now. But to give him a little bit of context, his nickname was Moose. He was a 6'7" man. We called him Opa, his grandchildren, because he came from a long lineage of Austrian aristocracy, meaning there is a lot of class privilege embedded deep in my family, but there is also a lot of pain. And he lost his father during World War II. my great-grandfather, who was a fighter pilot in the British Royal Air Force and was shot down. And at that point, his mother fled Europe with her 3 children. And first they landed in Canada on a very rural farm where there's all these lores about how my grandfather and his siblings used to take a rowboat to school. But then his mother left and, in my grandmother's words, abandoned her children. I think the trauma of war and losing a partner was too much for her to parent. So at that point, my grandfather moved to family who lived in Massachusetts. And due to that family's wealth and privilege, he was able to start moving up the rungs of New England elitism and got access to private boarding schools, went to Harvard Business School, and then started a career in commercial real estate where he ended up as CEO of a large Boston-based company that was valued around $50 million when it went public in the 1990s. So the next iteration of that story happens there because that's when he created trust funds. And I think I've started to name more of my grandfather's trauma because it feels like it informed so many of his decisions about the money that he earned and how he decided to pass it down. And this attempt to create security for next generations because it was something that he did not experience as a child. So he put that money into first 3 trusts, one for each of his children, and then 10 individual trusts for each of his grandchildren. And I sit right in the middle of those grandchildren. I'm also the oldest woman, socialized daughter on that side of the family. My mom is the youngest, but also the only daughter. And I also name this because gender has played a really important role in how people in my family were and weren't let into financial conversations. My mom had her own disillusionment with passing down information and wealth when she didn't get into any of the colleges that her brothers got into and was not extended that privilege of knowing how to navigate those systems of elitism. She took a year off between high school and college. She went and worked on a sheep station, and then she ended up going to the University of Vermont, which is where she met my dad, who had grown up in New Hampshire, and led to ultimately moving back to Vermont and raising her children, myself and my 2 younger siblings, in a really tiny rural town called Stratford. And this foundation is my money story, is growing up in this place where I think I had a lot of mixed messages about class and about wealth. This town had 1,000 people in it, mixed class, 10 kids in my grade whose families and parents fell along the class spectrum, from multi-generational Vermont farmers to professors at Dartmouth College, which was a 30-minute drive from where we lived. And my parents didn't work high-earning jobs. My mom ran a small business in that community for 25 years, and my dad worked in various jobs, but my predominant memory of him is actually as the stay-at-home parent for a lot of my childhood and someone who coached our youth sports teams and drove us all over Vermont. I was a really big soccer player, but I think that context made me feel really separate from family wealth. I knew it existed in my grandparents' world, and I knew it existed for my cousins who went to private school and sort of ran in the same spaces that my mom had grown up in, but was so separate from the town that we lived. And I also, of course, benefited hugely from my grandparents' wealth and class access. It was what allowed us to travel growing up. It paid for my liberal arts education, which is when I studied political science and feminist and gender studies, and really credit that to the beginning of my own radicalization and conviction that I would work in justice and towards justice. And so took a job with AmeriCorps after graduating college. And that was the year when I was 23 that I received an email from a multifamily office with a link to an investment account. And when I clicked that link, there was a portfolio worth $1 million with my name right on the top. It was jarring. Seeing that number in this moment felt sort of like a betrayal. It felt like there was this direct contradiction between the communities I wanted to be part of, the academic frameworks I had been studying, the activism and the activist identity I had been claiming for myself. And it really, that number made me complicit in this widening wealth gap. In a way, made me feel like I had been performative in my activism and in my advocacy because there was all this money in the background. And that produced a lot of guilt, which I became really fascinated with as an emotion. A big thing I learned about guilt is that it is a response to your own lack of action. And so to move through that guilt, I pretty quickly was like, okay, well, I need to take action. And this money was not earned by me. It does not belong to me. I want to put it back into community and I need to find people who can help me to do that. And it was at that time that I joined Resource Generation and I started working with a money coach whose name is Morgan Curtis. It is absolutely amazing. And really just started to build the confidence to even engage with what it meant to see seven figures in an investment account when you're 23 years old.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, the lore, and just the lineage of your family. I find it really fascinating how the decisions in which we're not even alive come to affect us today. It really points to the fact that we're all interconnected. It's not just affecting us as individuals, but it also affects our siblings, the communities around us, the global world, our relatives and ancestors. So your story, it resonates with me in the sense of belonging both to our families and the communities that we want to be a part of, and also belonging to social justice. And that being something that feels really core and it creates meaning for ourselves. So I'm curious how you started working with your money coach, finding RG, and moving through the guilt. How did that relationship to belonging shift as you started to move through all of that?
Oh, belonging. Yeah. What a theme. I think especially I was talking to someone recently who also works in this space. Her name is Nancy Reed, who talked about how those of us who grew up feeling confused about our class status and relationship to money are the ones who end up being drawn to this work to figure ourselves out and find belonging. And I just resonate with that so deeply. Resource generation was a first space of belonging for me in that I just saw other people transparently naming money as a part of their activism. It was not something that had to be separate from how they showed up for social justice. It actually could further and contribute to the movements that they wanted to be part of. And seeing that happen and then having this one-on-one accountability with Morgan really allowed me to start formulating a plan. And I love a plan and I love structure. So I had my giving spreadsheet and redistribution plan and just started plotting out where and how portions of the money in this trust could be moved. And that first year, I ended up redistributing $100,000, which was 10% of my assets at that time. And I had this plan to continue increasing that number while at the same time thinking really critically about the investments themselves and how I could divest and start to move the money I wasn't redistributing into funds that also felt aligned with my values, with my orientation towards justice. This is when a whole other series of obstacles started to arise because I learned that a trust fund is not just an investment account. It is a legal structure that is purposely designed to remove control from the beneficiary, which was me, and give control to the assigned trustee. And in my case, that was the trust company who was allowed to make decisions on my behalf for this pool of assets that they governed. And as I presented this plan about how I wanted to be redistributing and reinvesting, their red flags started to go up because clearly this was not sustainable. It was not going to allow the trust to continue to grow, which is the number one prerogative of financial industry experts. And again, I don't fault them for that. It's training, it's legal frameworks. There's a lot of fear of risk conditioned in that industry, as you know. It really started to feel frustrating because I felt like I was building the sense of empowerment and using action to move through my guilt. And suddenly all these mechanical obstacles were coming in the way of allowing me to do that. I guess, and in addition to the mechanical obstacles and to your question about belonging, there's this whole thread of generational conversation that continues from the moment really that I discovered the trust until now. And that is really a story about my mom and I, and how we, as women in our family, really had a legacy of being gatekept from financial wealth. We're able to come together to talk about this big thing, which was inheriting money and then deciding what to do with it and if you could do anything with it. And how she reacted to my decision to want to redistribute it was with panic, because she wanted her child to have a safety net and to also be given options in life. And she also watched her father work really hard and really long hours to earn this wealth that could now support these generations of our family. And that sense of belonging is what felt most jeopardizing to me, was really wanting my family and my mom in particular to be on my team, because she always had been. And I didn't want to do it if she didn't want to be with me. It wasn't worth fracturing our relationship over this money. We started going deep into what was coming up for us, what feelings this money was surfacing, what it meant about stability and scarcity and fear and choice. And we definitely disagreed at a lot of moments. And I did a lot of crying that summer. And I am not someone who cries very easily, but it was unlocking a lot, and came to this place of feeling really in line, especially when the conversation was able to evolve beyond just giving the money away, but also thinking about, okay, if we don't give all of this away, but we can at least remove it from these public industries that are continuing to extract from people and from planet, and put that money into local community and into these funds that I was finding, which in itself is a sense of belonging, because then you're literally investing in something that you believe in. You're actually aligning your investments with your way of being in the world beyond your money. And that felt really good to both of us. So that united us against the trust company, which then became the next stage of resistance.
I'm like, ooh, and I can't wait to dig into the next chapter of the story. And what you're naming makes me think so much around the prudent man standard as it relates to trust and being a trustee, and how that actually strips away your autonomy, and how that's connected to bodily autonomy and gender. And, being someone who was socialized as a woman, I also was socialized as a woman, and hearing what that united for you and your mom, who you named earlier. But your mom originally responded with panic and fear in the choices you were making because of the love that she has for you and her desire for you to be safe as an individual. Also hearing how both of you were able to move towards that lens of collective safety that, also benefits us as individuals. Can you share more about how you started to make some of these decisions around giving and redistribution, and then the solidarity economy investing, and how you also started to shift the mindsets and beliefs of people like your mom, and I know eventually the financial professionals you were working with? What strategies did you use? What worked? What didn't? And also, how did you discern for yourself which decisions felt aligned to you and which didn't?
One, yes, to the misogyny and trust. It's just so potent. There's a scholar, Brooke Harrington, who really focuses on wealth systems, and particularly where wealth gets hoarded and pocketed. And she has done a lot of research into trusts. And the modern origin of trust was actually during the Crusades, when men would go off to war and didn't want to leave property in the hands of their wives, and so would put it in trust so that another man could watch it until they returned. So it's just so deep how patronizing this structure is, ironically named after an emotion and a state of being that requires interdependence and requires reliance on other people. To thinking about my giving, it really shifted not only the structure. I started with that 100,000, and I had been planning to increase it by 50,000 for the next 3 years. That was my first time frame. 3 years, flex that muscle, understand what it feels to be giving away this much money when I have never even earned this much or close to it. Again, still a 23-year-old. And then I'll reevaluate. This was the first time that the trustee really leveraged their power to say no, because at that point I was starting to spend into the principle of that trust. It was no longer just the returns that were being generated. And so the trust would not grow. So they said, no, we're actually going to decrease your giving. We're going to limit you at 3% annually. So I went from 100,000 that first year to 40,000 the second year, a little bit less. And we're not going to shift any of the investments because the funds that you're proposing are too high risk, they're too low return, and we're not going to take on that liability. So that was the plan they presented. What was amazing was I had separate financial advisors from the trust company, who is my trustee. And I had been really persistent with them about these pledges that I had made to these various community groups and collectives, and was really following the guidance of resource generation about, so in alignment with social justice giving principles, thinking about multi-year pledges, thinking about giving to collectives and decentering my own control in giving and making sure it went to the hands of folks who are actually experiencing the inequalities. And so they helped me find some pretty duplicitous ways to continue to reach that $100,000 goal each year. The irony, again, in these trusts is that the sense of trust is so limited to biological family and to serving one individual. And they had to prove that everything I was doing was of a benefit to the beneficiary. And I am the beneficiary. And believe me, I wrote many letters saying that creating conditions that foster ecological growth and community wealth are beneficial to us all. And they're like, well, no. Like, do you want a car? Is that what you're asking for? So I created a whole inflated life budget saying my rent had tripled and I had this extra cost and this. And the financial advisors submitted that to the trust company and they approved that instead of the $50,000 grant I had promised to the land project in Vermont. But it still went through. So I was able to sort of like find, with a lot of help and assistance from industry insiders who I think were seeing a lot of this conversation unfurl for the first time. And they were really intrigued to see where it would go. Also, I realized this was not sustainable. And this is when I could see both my mom and my grandmother, who is still alive, start to understand and empathize with what I was trying to do, and seeing it be vetoed time and time again by this huge conventional entity that does not have my best interests at heart really brought them into the story, because they also were in support of land projects in Vermont and of Vermont Workers Center and of the movement for Black Lives and all of these places where I was trying to place this wealth. So they were able to start backing me. And I think with that family support, we were able to build more of a case that the trust company just couldn't ignore. The other thing that really shifted a huge linchpin in accessing more of this money so that we could each personally make our own decisions was that we actually found a letter that my grandfather had written to my mom when he was going through cancer treatment in the 90s. And he'd written her a lot of letters. And there was this one in particular where he talks about his own philanthropy and how he had been spent the last several decades of his business life working to address issues of poverty and education reform and healthcare in Boston. And by the end of it, realized that they'd made very little headway, and he regretted that they didn't try harder. It was this light bulb for all of us, because we weren't departing from his legacy. We weren't doing something that would have been antithetical to what he wanted and what he envisioned his family as part of. And instead, we could be the ones to try harder and the ones to push further. And so that is what really, I think, brought these three generations, my mom, my grandmother, myself, and my two younger siblings, into this final attempt to dissolve the trust, get out of that structure by writing letters that used that quote, that pulled some legal jargon with the help of a surprise legal ally that we found, and were able to convince the trust company to dissolve the accounts and outright distribute the assets. And that is where I think more of the actual intention behind how much am I giving, how much am I investing, has been able to surface, because now we have the options to think about how our theories of change can relate to money and operate from that place instead of this place of constriction and obligation on behalf of a trust. So to date, I have given away $500,000. There was an additional inheritance, as tends to happen in families with generational wealth. So despite redistributing half of what I originally inherited, by the time I started to move this money out of the trust fund, I was actually back at about $1 million, which meant that I am now an accredited investor and able to access a lot of the emerging funds that are trying to alleviate risk for those with less wealth. You have to have at least $1 million to invest in places that aren't going to have as high return, that are rooted in expanding capital to communities who haven't had it, but that means much longer loan terms. So that has created more of a ladder for my giving. I still operate in 3-year cycles just to give myself continuity with the pledges that I have, but also space to reevaluate based on what my own life looks like, which is something I did not really factor in when I was 23. And now think about a lot more actively of like, what do I want? What is my enough number as it relates to how much I'm earning? And does it allow me to be more intentional about creating a longer runway with this inherited wealth, as long as it is doing good while that runway still exists? It's in funds that I believe in. So I hit my highest redistribution number this year, giving away 200,000. Next year is back to 100,000 because a lot of that money is being moved into funds, so won't be as liquid. And I'm still maintaining that number for the next 3 years, and in 2026, I'll reevaluate.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And hearing the integrated capital, which for folks who are newer to that term, it's blending non-extractive investment. So investment with concessionary returns. There might be like a 0% return or a little bit that keeps pace with inflation. Patient capital that provides runway for many years. That is also paired with non-recoverable grants or with large donations. And this provides both runway for the organization or the folks who are working on a particular project, and then also longer-term financial stability. And it also provides the ability to get more lines of credit from other lenders, like banks, for example. So having $1 million in grants and non-extractive investment allows for folks to go get much lower interest rates from big banks for projects like land rematriation or asset rematriation that just requires so much capital to get started. We will talk more about that in future episodes. And so, Susanna, I know one big piece of wealth redistribution and moving towards more collective well-being is also building relationships. So what does that look like for you in terms of the redistribution that you're doing, and how has that evolved over the last several years?
It's been a balance. I think I launched into this work so politicized by a lot of resource generations teachings that I pretty steadfastly felt I needed to remove myself as the donor, as the rich person, as the person who historically has been given all the space to think and talk and decide. That person shouldn't be dictating where this money went. And so a lot of my initial pledges went to these large grant-making collectives like the NDN Collective and Movement for Black Lives and Thousand Currents. And I don't regret any of that, and I still give to them. But I did start to realize that I was missing that sense of building relationship, especially as it relates to place, because I did grow up in this really small town where relationships were everything and transcended class status and income and family of origin. That's really when I started to redirect a lot of my energy, both into my giving in Vermont and also to building my role in the Vermont chapter of Resource Generation and taking a leadership role on the partnerships team, which meant that I am the point person for those partnerships and can be that bridge from the spaces where wealth is concentrated to the spaces where wealth is needed, and can show up in mutuality with that, not as someone who is above the work, but as someone who is part of the work and contributing money. And I've learned a lot of that from my mom and my grandmother. I think they set an amazing example when it comes to seeing yourself more holistically than a financial number. And my grandmother, who really exemplifies that sort of feminine trope of being kept in financial ignorance, being told she wouldn't understand, being raised with the fear of money, but she was able to build this relationship with money and gain agency through giving a lot of it away, through coming to my grandfather and saying, these are the things that I care about. And they need this much, $50,000, and I know you can give it to them. So let's do this. And to his credit, would usually say yes. So she has had decades long relationships with all sorts of movement groups and land right groups and environmental activists that she has supported. And I've seen my mom really follow her lead in our community in Vermont, in New England more generally. And I think I'm just hoping to follow in their footsteps.
That is so beautiful and makes me think so much about the other types of capital that we have access to and can share, and redistributing our power as part of that. You also brought up guilt earlier, and I'm thinking about the connection to how you studied white guilt, and I'm excited to share more about the work that you're doing now. And before we get into where is Susanna now, could you share more about what you found through your studies and how that was connected to your own experience discovering the trust fund and navigating that with your family?
Yeah, this moment of the trust fund came at a really interesting moment when I had already committed to continuing my studies and was doing a master's program in gender studies, thinking that maybe I wanted to be an academic. I don't know. I like to read, I like to write. And then as I dove deeper into that work and into the space of gender theory, feminist theory, I'd studied this undergrad. So it really was just continued education. But I was also becoming just increasingly preoccupied with my personal redistribution story and how I was seeing these dynamics play out in my family in particular. I mentioned that I'm the middle of the pack of grandchildren, but I'm also the oldest daughter. All of the ones ahead of me were socialized as men, and no one else in my family had even mentioned this trust fund or this form of inheritance. No one was acting on it. No one was initiating conversation. And similarly, I had watched how my mom, as the only woman, had departed from this family culture. I was also noticing that resource generation was the space predominantly filled with people who identified or were socialized as women, and was curious what this phenomenon was. So I started to divert my studies into both this very personal examination of myself and this broader societal effect of what is pulling people in to the feelings around money, and then taking accountability for those feelings and doing something with them. And what was fascinating was looking really at the difference between guilt and shame. And that was a place that I started, and realized that shame is a really internal emotion, and it becomes a negative view of yourself and a way to think about your own identity. Whereas guilt is external. It's a negative view about how others are impacted. And it's a momentary feeling. It can be motivating because you think I did something bad, as opposed to shame where you think I am bad. And thinking about guilt as this call to action, it becomes actually a pathway. It doesn't have to be paralyzing. It can be something that is an acknowledgement of transgressive behavior, of the harm that might have been created with that. And a lot of studies have shown that it's really highly correlated with apology and reparative action. That's guilt. Shame is correlated with addiction and depression and sort of these self spirals that humans put ourselves into. So when I thought about guilt, I realized that I had started this journey in a moment of shame when I saw this trust fund and I thought, I am wrong for having this money. And that was a moment of identity where I could have sort of stayed paralyzed and not acted. But when I moved into guilt, I realized that this was not something that was core to who I am. This money is not who I am, but that it is actually wrong that systems have enabled this money to exist only for my benefit when there is so much other need and I have so many other privileges already. That guilt became a pathway to action when I realized I have the ability to move this money to the places that it's actually needed. And that can be a hard step because it means you have to confront your privilege, own your privilege. It means often being transparent about your financial or class or other forms of privilege, and also whiteness and how systems of race have allowed for this financial privilege. That piece around the emotion was really illuminating for me. And it coincides with gender because women are raised to feel that sense of compassion, to with these expectations that they're nurturing, they're selfless, they're caring for others. And so when you have this moment of guilt or shame around realizing you have something that other people need, there is a pull to want to fix that, to give to those who are in need. And that's where I was seeing again, not only in my immediate social circles, but at a societal level, Mackenzie Scott as a female divorcee inheriting billions of dollars that she is now moving rapidly to community in relation to her ex-husband who's flying to space. Like there seemed to be this pattern. And I think we're talking about it more now because we're seeing more women acting radically different with the money than their husbands or other men around them might have. But this work for me really also helped clarify my own feelings of separation. So again, back to the sense of belonging. I think it helped me feel a sense of belonging even when a lot of the decisions I was making and the actions I were taking felt like they were putting me at odds with my family culture, but really they weren't.
It also sounds like a form of healing too, being able to move from shame to guilt and then using the guilt as a catalyst to take that action and then move towards community and foster that sense of belonging. I know you were doing more than just moving the money itself. You've also been figuring out what is your role in this movement and what is your work to do. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about beyond financially, but just in your own day to day, how are you working to embody your values in your work? And what is that looking like for you these days?
Yeah, understanding my role has been a journey. To pay credit to some people who I really think about as pushing me into accepting and owning my role and owning my story. I think one of those people is Stephanie Braby, who runs the Good Ancestor movement in London. I was doing this dissertation research and work while I was living in London and was really looking for like-minded people and having had no sense of where to find them in the UK, but read this article in Yes magazine that was written by Chuck Collins, who is another mentor and another Vermonter, that talked about the Good Ancestor movement and the way that they were shifting wealth stewardship practices and inviting people into altering the way that they engage with wealth and engage with taxes. And this was run by Stephanie. And so I cold emailed her, maybe dropped a couple names like Chuck, and we met up for coffee and began what has become a multi-year ongoing friendship. And she came back into my life about a year later when I had left London. I had moved back to Vermont. In this quest to think about my role in this work, I was working at a nonprofit and running a program oriented towards food justice and sovereignty. But it didn't really feel like my work to do. It was important work, but it wasn't mine. And Steph came and visited me at this moment, and we were going on this walk along the waterfront in Burlington, Vermont. And she said, I'm doing this fellowship. It's called the Just Economy Institute. And if you really want this work to become bigger and move into a collective space, I think you should do it too. So I applied for this fellowship, and that fall ended up at the first of 3 week-long immersions that are the core pieces of this 9-month journey. And that is really where I felt this awakening around what I could offer to this work, not just what I had been doing personally, but that now I had an experience that I could offer to others and that I could use to guide others who find themselves in a similar position to me. And that came from growing my own confidence in my story, owning my own privilege and being more transparent about it in more of my social spaces and realizing that my story was not uncommon and that there are a lot of people who have privilege, wealth, class, racial, any intersection or combination of all of those, and are looking for ways to leverage it. To me, it felt like there was this missing piece around both the stories that show those people making decisions that challenge the status quo and the pathways to action that can actually mobilize those emotions towards moving money, moving resources. And another amazing thing that happened during the Just Economy Institute was that I met Leo Freeman, who both you and I work with. who is someone who comes from that practitioner side of working within the financial industry, starting in the very conventional belly of the beast of the financial industry, and then has moved into utilizing those skills and his licenses, his knowledge to helping progressive wealth holders, wealth builders build their sense of self, build their sense of wealth in alignment with movement. And so Leo represented this practitioner side and was interested in really creating space for professionals who are committed to social movements and climate movements to band together. And I was on this wealth holder side of people who have come into privilege, earned or inherited or otherwise, and need the support, need the practical help to make that money work on behalf of their beliefs. Together, decided there's an overlap here. And that has become Chosen Family Office, which is a group that exists outside of the financial industry, but we work to match values-driven wealth holders with professionals who are aligned with social, climate, and economic justice. Right now, my role as director of relationships is to serve as that guide for particularly the people who come in with money, really hold them to create a vision and then project manage that vision because it requires a lot of work. It is a lot of attention to detail to think about giving, to think about investing, to think about your personal budget, to think about collective action, to think about family conversations and relationships. And so we are this hub that can help hold all of those pieces for someone and also make sure that they are working with people who have the discernment and have the values alignment to not convince them out of this vision, which is something that happens to so many people is they get the political frameworks and they build the sense of self. And then they go to a financial advisor who tells them no. So that has been hugely rewarding to hold the beginning of that process, I think, for so many people and really help folks get grounded in their beliefs so that they can take that to these different spaces, to these different professionals. The other side of that work has been the storytelling piece and recognizing that we need more examples. And this is coming from me back at age 23, sitting in front of my laptop at a cafe and Googling, has anyone else given away $1 million when they're 25 years old? And not finding it. And I think we have examples like way up the class spectrum. We have examples that sort of think about people who have chosen to live this life that abdicates all forms of wealth, but there isn't a lot of examples of nuance and people who decide to sit in the middle, give some, invest some, bring their family into the story instead of rejecting their family who might rely on a lifestyle of wealth. So in an attempt to build a canon and an archive of those stories, we've also started this initiative called BUSTED, which is an acronym, stands for Breaking Up Sequestered Trusts and Endowments for Distribution. It's also just very catchy. And that is the place where I am now telling my trust bust story. I'm writing about my trust bust story and bringing in other voices who have challenged the status quo in their own unique way to show that there is no singular path to showing up in alignment with money, in alignment to justice. And it's been amazing.
Yes, and for anyone listening who hasn't read Susanna's writings on the Busted Chronicles on Substack, it's linked in the show notes. Definitely check it out, and you're going to hear more of Susanna's lore and some of the other stories that she's bringing in. And Susanna, can you share with listeners, what are your hopes? And I think of this too, as a project very much related to sharing stories of doing something different and how that can help move people. I know for me, so much of what I've been able to do came from seeing examples and models of people who are already doing it differently and being like, wow, that's actually possible. I had no idea. I didn't think it was, so I was too afraid to try. And yeah, could you just share more about 5 years, 10 years, however long from now, what's your hope that Busted and that Chosen Family Office does for the ecosystem?
I really hope that Busted becomes a place where intergenerational conversation can happen. I think that has been such a huge component and motivating force in my story is watching feeling how these conversations can move all of us. I mean, moving me as someone who graduated college and felt like I had to do things the right way, and the right way was the radical way. And then listening to my mom say that she had a different sense of how things should be done, but both of us softening into listening to each other and joining forces. Same with bringing my grandmother in. So that piece of Busted as something that doesn't speak to a certain audience, but can really come from voices across time to show that although it's never too late to make different decisions when it comes to money and power, and that there are always opportunities to rethink your role and rethink the way that you can leverage your resources and your skills and share that with a movement, with a group, with a community. That's another piece is also thinking about how Busted can start to highlight the different team players and team members who have been crucial to making redistribution visions, reallocation visions happen, and really shout out those amazing people who are also challenging the status quo in their industry or in their space of work, like my financial advisors who were able to create an inflated budget for my life, something I'm sure they had never done before. So I think it's an exciting way to show that there's always an opportunity to be surprised and that people might surprise you. I think with Chosen Family Office, the vision is that it becomes a large ecosystem where we're really creating integrated care teams for these clients. And we've thought about this in relation to the healthcare industry, where you have an advocate or an integrated care team coordinator who is able to be with you to advocate for you to all the different doctors or all the different specialists who come in to really focus on one individual. And the same is true in the financial industry. There are so many ways to be well and unwell as it relates to money and estate planning and your personal level of enoughness. And so we want to make sure that every person feels held, feels advocated for, isn't made to feel like they're not the expert in their own story, even when a lot of the jargon and a lot of the obstacles would tell you otherwise. It's also a way to bring cohesion to a lot of really amazing people who have been doing this work in silos and create a space where people can share and don't have to hold their client's reality all on their own or don't have to hold their work entirely separate from the rest of the ecosystem.
And it's so desperately needed, seeing so many people who have worked with a money coach and then go talk to their financial team or their advisor who basically just undoes all the work or tells them no and patronizes them. It's really demoralizing. And so it's special to me that something like Chosen Family Office exists. And as it spreads across the ecosystem, that it doesn't have to be this, this is the only one Chosen Family Office that exists, but there can actually be pluralism and multiple Chosen Family Offices to really meet this need. And one thing that I'm particularly curious about, you mentioned towards the beginning of your money story around how much is enough. And that's a question I don't think is truly answerable in the numerical sense because it's so personal. And I'm also curious how you orient to enoughness, both in this season of your life and also thinking longer term, how you approach that.
Yeah. Again, it's been helpful to think in chunks, but in chunks that also can lead to a larger vision. So my giving enough has, as I've said, operated in these 3-year pledge cycles, but is also now factoring in long-term what I might need to feel stable, what I might need to feel secure enough that I can continue to show up for this work in ways beyond just my financial giving, recognizing that I'm giving my time, I'm giving my energy, I'm giving my thoughts, I'm giving my writing. And so I need to make sure that I have a basis for that. And at the same time, where I'm at right now, I don't feel the pressure to continue accumulating wealth. I don't need my paid income to go into savings. I need it to cover my basic costs, which are usually between $3,000 and $5,000 a month. And so as long as I'm earning enough to cover that, then I don't feel anxious because I also recognize that I have this money that is now actively being moved into community loan funds, into regenerative farm funds, into OWISTA, which is an Indigenous Community Development Financial Institute, places where I can feel good about still potentially making a decision about that money later down the line if I need to use it for my own life, if that is something that will help me put a down payment on a house, if that is something that will help me pay for healthcare, but also recognizing that centering individuality over the collective action is not safety, that we need to be actually also taking risks to ensure that there is a collective safety net. Constantly checking myself as to what actually is making me feel supported, sustained, not living in a place of stress or anxiety, but also doesn't feel like I'm overly comfortable. And I am questioning the decisions I make around spending. Right now, the amount in this account that I have now shifted of my inherited wealth still hovers at around $1 million because that money is being moved, but it's into these funds that I'm sequencing so that I can get in as an accredited investor. But at the same time, once I'm in, I'm going to continue to evaluate how much I can give each year, maintaining these pledges and also really communicating with my partners, those who I am pledging and giving the money to, what my constraints might be, what it might look like if I need to start decreasing my pledges because I've distributed more, or this money is now in a 10-year long note to support growth stage businesses in Vermont. And that also is a form of giving. So it's fluctuated a lot over the last couple of years, but I feel liberated from the sense of needing my work to be something that catapults me into another tier of wealth and of privilege, because that is the chase that I also feel like my parents did not succumb to.
Yeah. Makes me think a lot about what it means to be satisfied and to really embody being content and experiencing joy without relying on consumerism or commodities to be the sole source of that joy. And I know we covered a lot, Susanna. Every time I talk to you, it's like a light lights up inside me. I love talking to you. And I also want to make space for anything else that you want to share with listeners. Are there patterns or trends that you're noticing? Just if you could wave a magic wand, what do you wish that folks tuning in today already knew?
Well, I'll first say that the feeling is so mutual. I love talking with you, and I love that you are bringing these stories into the world. I've shared a lot of resources and names already. One thing that is just maybe like a tidbit of wisdom from a professor named John Powell, who runs the Institute of Othering and Belonging at UC Berkeley, and has this quote that I think about a lot, especially in financial industry, but applies broadly. And that is to be hard on structures and soft on people. It just adds a level of humanity to any work that you do beyond thinking about the concrete resources or the concrete numbers. Just knowing and looking for people to be on your team and recognizing the limitations, but also seeing the humanity in everyone. And I think that is what allowed me to bust my trust. That is why I'm so interested in telling these stories and talking with you, and just generally finding alternative ways to build structure, because I think if you build it, people will come.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, even these people who created these nasty systemic conditions, one where there's so much power over and enclosure of the commons, I do think there's a commonality in that one of the motivations is to keep themselves safe. And that's done through othering. And we all are moving towards what we believe is safety. And so I think recognizing that, wanting to be safe and wanting to feel cared for and protected, that's a human condition. And that also, by finding that humanity in others, we then get to create the conditions to disrupt those systemic structures. So thank you for naming that. And that's not to excuse the systemic conditions that we're living in or to excuse what led up to creating that condition in the first place, but also how can we move towards healing and repair. For anyone tuning in who has inherited wealth, who's feeling stuck, maybe you have a trust fund you want to bust, maybe you have an endowment that you want to spend down, Maybe you just have this big asset that you're like, I don't know what to do with. Maybe you want to change the rules within the financial industry, which is connected to a just transition, changing the rules all across the board to furthering a just transition. So Susanna is an amazing person to talk to if you want to explore any of those topics. And Chosen Family Office is an excellent resource to find your integrated care team. And check out Busted. There's incredible stories there, and you'll be moved in one way, shape, or form. Thank you, Susanna. Thank you so much for listening to the Reimagine Wealth podcast. You can find resources and links from today's episode in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, subscribe, and share this with those in your community. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a paid member of my Substack, which allows me to sustain this work and have more episodes to share in the future. Again, links to all of that and more are in the show notes. And until next time, I'm sending you resilience and warmth, and thank you so much for tuning in.